Hello. Today we're covering correspondence analysis, the advanced version of perceptual mapping that lets the data reveal the structure of your market rather than requiring you to guess it yourself. If you've ever seen a perceptual map with brands and attributes plotted together on the same chart and wondered how those positions were calculated, this video is for you. By the end, you'll understand what correspondence analysis is, how to interpret the map it produces, and what it can tell you about your brand's position and competitive landscape. Let's start with the problem. Here's the limitation that correspondence analysis solves. When you build a simple perceptual map, you have to pick two attributes to use as your axes, maybe price versus quality, or traditional versus innovative. Those two axes produce a useful picture, but it is only as good as the axes you choose. What if price and quality aren't actually the dimensions that differentiate brands in your category? What if the real drivers of perception are something like indulgence versus health, or familiar versus exciting? Things you didn't think to plot, or dimensions that don't correspond to any single attribute you measured. Choosing the wrong axes means missing the actual structure of your market. The core shift in correspondence analysis is this. Instead of you choosing the axes, the data chooses them. You feed in a rich table of brand attribute ratings from consumers, and the algorithm mathematically identifies the two underlying dimensions that best capture how brands and attributes differ from each other. Those dimensions emerge from the data. They reveal what's actually driving differentiation in the category, whether or not you had the insight to hypothesize it in advance. The data shows you the structure. Your job is to interpret what you find. Correspondence analysis is a statistical method that takes a table of brands and attributes rated by consumers and reduces them to two underlying dimensions, then plots brands and attributes together on a single map. Brands appear near the attributes that best describe them and far from the ones that don't. Two brands sitting close enough together on a map are seen as similar by consumers. An attribute sitting in empty space means no brand owns that perception. All of that information comes from the math, not from decisions you made about which axes to use. It's worth being clear about how correspondence analysis differs from the simpler version of perceptual mapping. A simple perceptual map uses two attributes you've chosen, say price and quality, and positions brands along those two axes. It's fast, intuitive, and easy to explain in a presentation, but it's fundamentally limited to the two dimensions you picked. Correspondence analysis takes many attributes, often 10, 15, or more, and identifies the two most important underlying dimensions from all of them simultaneously. It's more complex to produce and harder to explain to a non-technical audience, but it reveals structure you might have missed entirely. Simple maps are great for communication. Correspondence maps are great for discovery. Let's apply this to a real scenario. Oatwave is a plant-based oat milk brand competing against 5 other brands on a crowded grocery shelf. The team has done basic perceptual mapping and has a rough sense of the market. But now they want a richer, more data-driven picture. Specifically, how do all 6 brands compare across 10 different category attributes simultaneously? And what are the underlying dimensions that actually drive differentiation in the plant-based milk category? Not the dimensions the team assumes, but the ones consumers actually use to distinguish one brand from another. The analysis starts with a survey. For each brand and each attribute, you ask consumers to rate how well that attribute describes that brand on a 5-point scale. For Oatwave's study, 6 brands and 10 attributes means 60 individual ratings per respondent. You average those ratings across all respondents to produce a grid, one number for every brand attribute combination. That grid is the raw material the correspondence analysis runs on. The better your survey data, larger sample, more representative respondents, more carefully chosen attributes, the more reliable the output. Here's what the grid looks like. Rows are brands: Oat Wave, Almond Pure, Oat First, Cocoa Blends, Soy Rich, and Store brands. Columns are 10 attributes: creamy, healthy, sustainable, affordable, premium, trendy, trusted, boring, thin, and delicious. Each cell is an average rating. How strongly respondents associate each brand with each attribute. 60 numbers in total. And here's the problem. 60 numbers in a table is rich data, but it's nearly impossible to look at that grid and intuitively understand what it means about how these brands compare to each other. That's precisely the problem correspondence analysis solves. It takes 60 numbers and turns them into a visual picture you can read at a glance. The algorithm analyzes the brand's attribute grid and identifies the two underlying dimensions that captures the most variation in how brands and attributes relate to each other. Variation in this context just means the spread of differences in the data. Capturing more variation means explaining more of what makes brands different from one another. For Oat Wave's study, the results look like this. Dimension 1 explains 58% of the dimension. Dimension 2 explains 24%. Together, those two dimensions capture 82% of the story, which means a two-dimensional map gives you a very faithful picture of a complex 60-point dataset. The two dimensions don't come pre-labeled though. That's the next step. To understand what the two dimensions represent, you look at which attributes cluster at each end of each axis. For dimension 1, one end is associated with the attributes delicious, creamy, and premium. The other end is associated with affordable, thin, and boring. That's a clear contrast. Call it indulgence versus value. For dimension 2, one end pulls together sustainable, healthy, and trendy. The other end groups trusted and familiar. That's a contrast between what's new and exciting versus what's established and safe. Call it new versus established. Those two dimensions, indulgence versus value, and new versus established, are what's actually driving differentiation in the plant-based milk category. Not price versus quality, not thick versus thin. Those are the real axes revealed by the data. Now we plot everything. The horizontal axis runs from value on the left to indulgence on the right. The vertical axis runs from established at the bottom to new at the top. Brands and attributes appear together on the same map. Oat Wave sits in the upper middle area, perceived as new and trendy, but not strongly associated with indulgence or rich sensory experience. Almond Pure occupies the upper right, new, trendy, and indulgent, close to delicious and premium. Oat First sits right next to Oat Wave. They are perceived almost identically. Store Brand and Soy Rich huddle in the lower left near affordable and boring and trusted. And that upper right quadrant, brands that are both indulgent and trendy new, has an open space with no brand near it. That's the white space. That's the opportunity. Here's how to read any correspondence map. When a brand sits close to an attribute, it means consumers strongly associate that brand with that characteristic. It's clear owns perception. When a brand sits far from an attribute, the brand doesn't own that perception. Consumers don't connect them. When two brands sit close to each other, they're perceived as similar and are therefore direct perceptual competitors, regardless of their actual product difference. And when a brand sits in empty space, not near any attribute in particular, it's undifferentiated. Consumers don't associate it strongly with anything, which usually signals a weak or unclear position in the market. 3 strategic findings for Oat Wave from this map. First, Oat Wave clearly owns the sustainable and trendy positioning. That's a real coherent perception among consumers. It's valuable, but it appears primarily to a specific sustainability-motivated audience. Second, Oat Wave is far from creamy and delicious, the sensory attributes that drive broad category purchase across all consumer types. That gap is a product and messaging vulnerability. Third, the upper right quadrants, brands that are both indulgent and trendy or new, is completely empty. No brand currently owns the position of being exciting and genuinely satisfying. That's a real positioning opportunity. And finally, Oat First sits almost on top of Oat Wave. They're fighting for identical perceptual territory, which means one of them is likely to lose that fight eventually. One of the most powerful applications of correspondence analysis is running it on a regular cadence, typically annually, and overlaying the maps year over year. That comparison tells you whether your brand's position is actually moving. Did Oatwave's investment in a creamier formula and new sensory messaging shift their positions toward creamy and delicious? Did Almond Pure and Oat First manage to differentiate from each other, or are they still occupying the same perceptual space? Did a new brand move into the white space opportunity and claim it before Oatwave could? Year-over-year correspondence map make a perceptual movement visible and trackable, turning brand strategy from a set of intentions into a set of measurable outcomes. Let's be balanced. The strengths of correspondence analysis. It handles many brands and attributes simultaneously in a way no simple two-axis map can. It reveals underlying dimensions that you might never have thought to plot. The structure emerges from the data rather than your assumptions. It positions brands and attributes on the same map, making associations immediately visible. And it's a powerful tool for annual tracking or brand positioning. The limitations are real too. The dimensions have to be interpreted. They don't come with labels, and two different analysts might interpret the same map differently. Stable results require a large enough sample, and the output, while visually rich, can be hard to explain to stakeholders who aren't familiar with it. The practical approach is to use correspondence analysis for discovery and strategic planning, and translate your findings into a simpler two-axis map for communication and presentation. 6 things to take with you. Correspondence analysis lets the data choose the axes rather than you choosing them, which means it reveals the actual structure of your market rather than confirming your assumptions about it. Brands cluster near the attributes that best describe them. Proximity means association. Two brands sitting close together are perceptual competitors, regardless of their actual product differences. Empty space on the map is a positioning opportunity, unclaimed perceptual territory that the right brands could move into. The dimensions that emerge from the analysis reveals what actually driving differentiation in your category, not what you assumed was driving it. And run it annually to track whether your brand strategy is producing real movement in how consumers perceive you. Because perceptions change slowly, and you need the data to see it. Thank you for watching.